in some kind of local examples and some mapping and various kind of layers of mapping, and not just concentrations of poverty, but looking at the air quality and the number of maybe code issues in a particular neighborhood, to access to transportation, to school performance, and why. So when you kind of look at those all in totality, sort of what makes up the conditions of a community that leads to somebody saying something when they're looking to buy a house, oh, I just want to live in a neighborhood with good schools. Like, how do we get to a place where we have these disparities about it? And what does it mean to have a good school? Those will be some of the conversations we'll have each week. We're definitely open to kind of changing the pace, but really don't worry if you kind of fall behind each week, because so much of the conversation kind of tee you up to read the next section. But this book it's something that would have been, this book was put out in 2017 or so, but they could have put this book out right prior to the housing crisis, 2008. We'd have the same issues. This book could be put out in 2017 or 2027. We'd have the same issues. And just this week, the president put out something on Twitter that was saying he was concerned about, he's been hearing from people in the suburbs about this AFFH rule, and that he was going to be looking into it. And so it's like this topic, what does it mean to affirmatively further fair housing? Why do we have the conditions we have today that necessitate conversation and policy change around access to housing? It's something that's not in the past, it's ever present. And as we were kind of working through this fair housing assessment to follow the rule of the affirmatively furthering fair housing, it was contentious even in the process. And so kind of where we are today, the Housing and Urban Development, they delayed the implementation of this rule in 2018 because they had indicated there was some confusion amongst local communities about how we engage and implement some of these the rules. And that wasn't the case. Locally, many communities, much like ours in Omaha, said we really like the expanded view of what's impeding someone's ability for housing. It's not just a housing choice, it's about transportation, neighborhood, the environment, the where employment locations are had. Like it's both private action, which we'll talk about quite a bit in this book, and tactics of the local neighborhoods or associations or the real estate industry. And then it's also stabilized by policy. And so we'll kind of get into many of those topics week by week. So the book is relevant today, and as it would have been 10 years ago or 10 years from now. So that's kind of where we'll touch on. And the book outlines some examples of Ferguson and Michael Brown that really sort of ground us in where we are currently as well in the national conversation that Wendy talked about. I think there's plenty of material in the book for us to cover. So that's sort of the format of how we'll kind of go week by week. But we also just want to provide kind of an overview of the book itself. So we'll kind of pass it over to Mike.
Yeah, great. And as Jeff noted, we'll have sort of targets throughout the 5-week study to say, we'll be trying to say, chapters 2, 3, and 4, whatever the case may be, and we'll try to pull themes for the following week's discussion from those chapters. But do not worry if you fall behind, because I think you'll note as you start reading the book that all of these themes are intertwined. And so, we'll provide kind of a brief overview of the book and what to expect and kind of how it's structured, some of the central themes to it, and really kind of how we'll be focusing a lot of our discussion. And then our hope here for the last half of tonight's book study is really just to kind of start with some framing questions, understanding that many of you haven't read the book yet or haven't read kind of through chapter 1, or may not even own the book yet, or have the opportunity to check it out at the library. So we'll start with some questions that really just kind of frame out some of the central issues. But to start, the book itself is written by Richard Rothstein, who is really a luminary in educational policy. And a lot of his work prior to writing The Color of Law was focused on issues of academic achievement in schools. And a lot of that came back to these achievement gaps that we see, not just based on race, but based on income, based on the conditions that children live in at home. And really, what focused him to write The Color of Law was a series of Supreme Court cases that set this standard about what they termed de facto segregation. So the most recent case was in 2006, and the opinion was written by Chief Justice Roberts, and it really pointed to that there wasn't a need for a constitutional remedy for government to take action in this particular case, because the circumstances that led to the neighborhood that these schools are in being segregated was the result of terrible, deplorable private action, whether it was sort of biased, sort of motives of homeowners, whether it was real estate agents steering people to and from different neighborhoods, whether it was, school choice and people having the means to kind of make choices about where they live and how they, choose to be in schools, but they sort of fell onto this note that really the government played no active role in shaping communities, particularly in sort of this organization that we see in metro areas across the country, where our communities are incredibly segregated by race, and particularly with concentrations of Black and African-American residents. And so the book really, he jumps off from that point, and he doesn't really kind of say whether that's a good constitutional test or a bad constitutional test, but he just says they're really not looking at the right facts. And so each chapter, kind of following the introduction, kind of takes a different thread where the government's action is really intertwined with the private action, and really in a lot of ways can instigate private actions of biased individuals, amplify those biases, but is really central to how our communities are shaped over time. And so the distinction there, the Chief Justices called it de facto segregation, but the author is really pointing to this notion of de jure segregation, where the government plays a real central role in really implementing policies that are explicitly race-based. And you'll note on the cover of the book, the subtitle is The Forgotten History of How the Government Segregated America, because mid-century this was well known. And in leading up to the Civil Rights Act in 1968 that included the Fair Housing Act, it wasn't really a secret that government policy had shaped communities. And it's this idea that with the Civil Rights Act of 1968, that were really ending the ability for people to privately discriminate in housing decisions, that the work was done. And sort of the closing piece of the book is really to say that the work of the civil rights movement, particularly in housing, is incomplete, and that there's a lot to be done. And so the book, kind of each chapter takes a different element of that, a different theme of that, a different way that these private and public actions are intertwined, and really shows that it wasn't just endemic to the South. It wasn't just endemic to these large metropolitan areas that we think of today having large concentrations of poverty, whether they're New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, but it's really everywhere, including Omaha, including places like St. Louis. And he starts with the example of San Francisco, which is the chapter 1 of the book, and really focuses on one particular story, Frank Stevenson, who was a person who was in the Great Migration and migrated to California to take advantage of some of the industrial growth in the Bay Area, and how that's intertwined with a lot of policies around World War II and really kind of the economic boom that followed. And the other story is Robert Merriday on the East Coast in Levittown, so Long Island, New York. Levittown might be something or a story that you're familiar with in terms of kind of single housing boom following World War II. And Robert Merriday, being a returning veteran, starting a trucking company, hauling drywall for the construction of Levittown, not being able to purchase a house in Levittown itself, and really having means that weren't just equivalent to the residents of Levittown, but actually in many ways exceeded the working class families that were able to live in Levittown. So these stories, these recurring characters are really kind of there to really demonstrate how these themes of really what can't be termed as anything else as economic suppression are really intertwined throughout our history, mostly from about World War I to the middle of the century. So, you know, kind of the 1960s time frame. So each chapter kind of starts around, you know, 1910, 1920, and kind of carries you forward to the 60s and kind of starts over again. So, you know, there's a lot of callbacks. So that's why I say, you know, don't get discouraged if you feel like you fall behind. You're going to hear the story over and over again, and the author does a great job of connecting the themes of the book. But that idea of de facto versus de jure segregation is something you're going to see over and over and over again, and it's this legal test that the Supreme Court has used to basically say the government doesn't have a role in fixing these problems in our communities. And the author would make the case that the government had a very explicit role in shaping the communities that we have today, and thusly, you know, should have some role in taking action. So one of the policies, and I think it's on, it's the map, it's the cover image of what we're talking about, or for this book study, is this idea of redlining, and really these home ownership loan corporation maps, and how they shaped our communities in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and how they continue to shape our communities today, and how it was a very explicitly race-based policy. Black and brown people made neighborhoods less desirable in the eyes of the Homeownership Loan Corporation, local realtors, and the Federal Housing Administration. And so it's a real visible way that government policy has shaped our community. It's one of the more lasting ways that government policy has really shaped our communities, but it was reinforced by manifold other issues and policies that kind of converged to create the set of issues that we're still really hoping to fix today. So that's really a brief overview of what's in store. So, you know, our hope is kind of break up the book into, you know, these 5 chunks, tonight being kind of the introduction in chapter 1. If you haven't gotten that far, don't worry, don't sweat it. We'll be back with more. But with that, I think, Jeff, if we want to probably first ask if there's any questions about the format of the book study, you know, what we're really trying to cover in this, and just housekeeping questions. Otherwise, we have some discussion questions that we'd love to get some feedback from all of you on.
Yeah, that's right. We've, you know, it's been about 30 minutes and we've been talking the whole time. So we wanted to, which we can do plenty of that, and we don't need to. So
yeah.
Well, really, like from your perspective, there's, you know, some feedback in the chat, but as Mike alluded to at the end here, this topic of redlining, it's probably, my assumption is that's kind of the entry point that a lot of you have. You've heard of the topic of redlining, and the book will uncover much more than just that, but really how that has kind of stabilized segregation and allowed it to continue for many generations. But so just curious, it's some more context to our group here. You know, kind of why you joined the group, and what is your awareness of segregation and how it's in our community and how it's changed over time.
I'm curious, do you know if the exhibit at the Union is still open? And perhaps we could do a virtual tour.
It most definitely is.
Yeah.
It's a permanent exhibit, and that's part of our plan is there is a video, since we can't really go there in person right now, but to have Brigitte McQueen or Paige Wrights be part of one of our weeks to walk us through that exhibit. Yes, very much so.
Yeah, and if you know, when we're out of this mess of the pandemic, and I would encourage you to go to that exhibit. It is an incredible experience where you can sort of actually sit with and really kind of meditate on the local context of these issues. And the book will be a great preparation. You'll understand many of the things that they're talking about in the interpretive exhibits, but the Union's done just a tremendous job with that exhibit, and we're so excited that they made it permanent.
For those of you that may
Jeff
not
noted,
be familiar,
go ahead,
just like the Union for Contemporary Art is on 24th and Lake, and the exhibit, it's called Undesign the Red Line. I'll put it in the chat here, but it was a project that was originally in Brooklyn, New York, in the Parsons School of Social Design, and they kind of looked at redlining and as a design problem, and kind of what sort of undergirded that structure, and how might you undesign that process. And so the exhibit walks you through some kind of national timelines and then some local history in the Omaha metro area around the issue of redlining and segregation. And then it poses some really good questions to you as someone that's experiencing that exhibit as an individual, and who you're connected with, and what organizations you're a part of that could be a part of that change, and then some kind of policy recommendations. It is very powerful, and it's something that we should definitely, like said, encourage you to be a part of that. So again, just sort of curious from your perspective, why is redlining the topic you're familiar with? Kind of why are you part of this book discussion, and what is your kind of level of understanding of redlining or segregation and its history in Omaha? Just kind of curious to get the group's kind of vantage point. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello, am I on?
You're good.
Yeah, I was. My interest is partially related to the issue of prison reform. They're looking at building a new prison in the next year to two, and I've really been looking at issues that are fueling the mass incarceration in the community, and the history of racism and segregation clearly have a role to play in that. So that's part of my interest in this book. I heard the speaker, or the author, speak a year or two ago when he was in town, and I think this issue, I'm really glad you guys are doing the book. It's really got useful information in terms of the history of Omaha.
Thank you, Paul.
I'm Fiona Kennedy. I'll jump in here for a second. I really began to understand redlining during college. I grew up in Omaha, was not aware, didn't learn about redlining in most of my education throughout Omaha, and began to understand it towards the end of my college career. I moved back to Omaha to pursue a career in urban planning. And that's when I found the exhibit at the Union for Contemporary Art on Design the Red Line. And I was a tour guide there from when it opened last July until about February. And it's really such an incredibly built exhibit, with looking at redlining through the lens of a city that I grew up in and a city that so many of us live in, where, as Mike kind of said, this redlining and the context of redlining and the effects of redlining, people from a small, mid-sized Midwestern city don't really think of it affecting our cities the way that it has. And so that was one of my biggest takeaways from leading tours throughout the exhibit on Design the Red Line, is that when you can look at the map of Omaha and see these policies put into place in our city, what a big difference it makes through understanding the concept and how it got put into place, and how detailed and the intent was there. And it was very, they knew it was coming from the policies, and it was successfully created to segregate our cities in this way. So that's been my involvement in this throughout Omaha, and I saw this on Facebook. I'm not involved with Tri-Faith or the Urban Abbey right now, incredible organizations, but I'm thrilled that I stumbled upon this on Facebook and joined the event.
Thanks, Fiona.
My name's Molly, and I was interested in doing this book study. I work at Heartland Family Service in the homeless prevention program, and I deal with individuals who are facing homelessness, and I hadn't heard of redlining until I started working in this program. And especially with just kind of the state of the world right now, I feel like it's more important to educate myself the best way that I can. And I saw this because I was an intern at Tri-Faith, and I was like, oh my gosh, what a great way to get involved with my community and learn. And so thank you so much for putting this on.
Uh, I'm Susan Davies, and mostly relate to the Urban Abbey as well as First Methodist Church, and saw this and I saw it somewhere and I thought, this is fabulous. I remember as a late high school, early college person being involved in a demonstration in North Omaha with my parents, demonstrating against redlining. That was over 50 years ago, 55 or plus years ago. And I've cared about this for a long time, and I'm delighted to be involved in something that is, grappling with it from a community, a national, regional, and as well as local context. So thanks to all of you who put this in place.
Thanks for your steadfast commitment to the issue over so long. Thank you.
I'm Carrie.
I guess we didn't change it. I guess we didn't change it with that one demonstration, but just.
Yeah, but we can safely say maybe you started it in the area, or you started it, which is a good thing. My name is Carrie Nath. Right now I attend the Urban Abbey. Born and raised up through 8th grade in Omaha. And in my 7th grade years when they started busing within the Omaha school district. And so that was back in '77. And it was a time to be at school. And I reflect on that now as an adult and all the questions around that. But I'm an arts educator and I work in theater and dance and music, and my career has been working with students and providing a platform, or trying to provide a platform for students to share their voice. So I lived in Seattle and I lived in Baltimore and I lived in Kentucky, in both Lexington and Louisville, and worked in neighborhoods where a lot of students didn't have a voice. And I was fortunate to be able to work with great partners in doing that. But you could have picked up any one of those schools and transferred them to the exact same neighborhood in all those areas. And the questions kept being, why, what is happening? Why is this way? And not until I got to Louisville did I hear of redlining and even begin to understand. We were busy trying to provide a platform, but the understanding of change is understanding what's happening. And so just moved back to Omaha. I'm so excited about this group. Great. So that I
That's
can
a great perspective.
Better, thank you. Yeah, to better understand the issues, and now how can I move forward and use my skill set and my access to things and be able to support and provide that platform with even a greater understanding. And I have so much to learn. So grateful that this is here with a group of people who are truly want to learn and want to incite change. And thank you for making this opportunity available.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to touch on a couple of these comments so far, that this idea that you didn't know redlining existed makes me recall an example. Last year, there's a transportation and housing kind of study and project that the City of Omaha and the Metro Area Planning Agency engaged in on North 24th Street, and it's called the Forever North Study. And we were actually at the Union in the basement doing a design session with the community. And there was at my table, I remember there's someone named Juanita who we were talking about the neighborhood and what improvements might need to be made. And she, as I kind of learned her story, said she had grown up on 24th and Lafayette, just a few blocks down from 24th and Lake. And as she made her way to the basement for this design session, she walked through the redlining exhibit, Undesign the Redline. And she had no idea that redlining was this thing that existed. And yet she had lived, just a few blocks away her whole life. And as she was kind of telling the stories of the impacts in North Omaha, she communicated that she just assumed that these were issues of her individual efforts or her friends and neighbors and what they could or couldn't do. She didn't understand that it was this big structural issue that was happening to her. And so it is a serious problem in our community. That's those that are most impacted weren't even aware of it. So this learning and unlearning is really vital for us. And I just want to kind of think about that in light of the next question for us is, and what was just recently brought up about the role of education and this lack of awareness of the government's role in segregating our community. And so just curious from your experience, can you, because I can't recall in my own experience, I should say, in history class ever being taught the government's role in segregating our country. So I'm curious if that's just unique to me or if others had a similar experience of the role of education and learning or of what did or didn't happen as far as segregation goes.
When I was an undergraduate out in California, I took a course on the history of Los Angeles. Went to school at UCLA, and we almost immediately from the very beginning, it talked about how the city as it developed was really structured and designed to accommodate this core belief in the superiority of certain groups over the rest of the population there. And I came to very viscerally understand what redlining was, because Los Angeles is perhaps, and was at one point, the most segregated city in the United States. The Jews lived in Beverly Hills, Mexicans lived in East LA, the blacks lived in Compton and South Central, the Protestants lived in Pasadena, and it was all by design. There was no accident to that. And it was really stunning because here I am, my head in the sky thinking that I live in this wonderful world and coming to understand that it was anything but. And that's kind of followed me in my journey, both as an academic, and then now, I've lived in Omaha for 20 years. It was one of the things that I first really did a little bit of reading on before I came here, the extent to which it had been subjected to that same kind of design, that kind of planning. And there aren't really a lot of accidents in terms of how that's manifested itself in American society. And it's a gift that keeps on giving, because what it does, it really kind of foments and promotes these notions of this innate superiority that I think really leads us down a very, very slippery slope that's almost impossible to get out of once we go down it. And yet, I'm very happy that we're having this conversation, but I almost feel at the same time, it should have been happening back in the 60s when we passed the Fair Housing Act. Everybody knew how we had gotten there, and everybody knew the purpose of that redlining and segregation had served in American society. And we've been so slow to unpack it. I mean, Susan's comment that 55 years ago, she was protesting against this. And we're seeing the impact of it still to this very day. I think, Chicago should be the most salient point today as what it does to a community when we don't allow for there to be wealth creation, when we don't allow for people to really truly pursue, the best versions of themselves, because they have been very materially constrained by design.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Any other thoughts on Jeff's point about learning about segregation in America or issues like redlining in school?
So I'm Larissa, and I joined this group just because I am interested in educating myself more about this, and I particularly liked being able to understand this idea and of like the systemic racism, but specifically how it's been enacted in Omaha. But I'm a public school educator, and so talking about, well, when do we educate? And for several years, I was kind of like, this is so hard. And then I realized, wait, I'm a gatekeeper in a system that upholds these ideas. And so several of my fellow coworkers and I are working on diversifying our curriculum. But I would say overall, we don't teach our kids about multiple narratives of these stories. We give them a single narrative. And it's a really damaging narrative because we don't bring up redlining. We don't bring up, you know, why shouldn't we maybe celebrate Columbus Day? Why might there be a negative point to talking about him and honoring him? I know for myself, I didn't learn about redlining until I took an elective as part of my graduate program. So if I hadn't chosen to take an education of liberation class, it may have been years and years until I learned that existed. Because I didn't grow up in Omaha, I grew up in Hastings, which is a small community, South Central. And my experience there was we didn't have any diversity. So to understand in more metropolitan areas that this is something that occurred is just something so out of what my growing up experience was.
Great, thank you so much.
This is Harris, and I'll jump in on piggybacking on that. Having grown up in Scottsbluff, small town, western Nebraska, you know, you could count the number of Black families on one hand probably that we had in our community, but we did have a large Hispanic population. Scottsbluff continues to have. And my perspective is kind of unique because I'm the daughter of a real estate appraiser. And so he owned his own small business for, you know, however many years. And so I sort of grew up around the dinner table learning about, you know, houses and values and all of, so I, you know, kind of understanding the market of real estate and all of these things. But, and I think I probably understand a little bit more. Maybe there wasn't specific redlining in my small town, but I understand that there's enough subjectiveness to a lot of the process that could effectively create the same outcome. And so I'm going to be really curious to reflect back on, you know, that what I learned around the dinner table and think about how it might have contributed the same way. And then maybe if I have the courage to ask my dad, who's now 88 years old and extremely conservative, what his thoughts are on this, might be another interesting conversation he and I can have.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, you know, it's interesting as we're, you know, as Jeff and I were talking about the type of discussion that we wanted to lay out for this book, you know, Larissa and Julie, your points are things that, you know, Jeff and I reflected quite a bit on. The ideas of, you know, white supremacy, we think about it at the time of the Confederacy and, you know, states seceding from the Union and things like that. And all of the ideas that are wrapped up in that kind of moment in our country, but we don't think about how those biases really won out nationally, how they were really carried forward into policy into the 20th century as well. And also this idea of how it's tied to broader themes that we are taught a lot about, both through society and through our education, of ideas of the American dream being so closely tied to home ownership. And when we start to unpack some of these policies that explicitly denied those opportunities from particular populations, including Blacks in our major metropolitan areas, and we really have to kind of think about what exactly those stories represent. And so that's why we wanted to start with that education question, because it is one of these ideas that, you know, as we start to think about the generations that really it's taken to kind of get to where we are today, you know, what's that sort of generational change that we can look forward to as well? And how do we start to, you know, prime ourselves for that work ahead? So with that, you know, in the minutes that we have remaining here, because we're going to be respectful of your time, we're going to get you out of here at an hour. You know, one thing that Jeff and I have kind of been talking about throughout this this time here is really who else you want to hear from in this 5-week course, in this 5-week sort of discussion, not really course, this course of discussion. You know, there's, you know, these perspectives of real estate, there's these perspectives of lending, you know, faith communities have obviously a role throughout the work that's been done over the last century in terms of civil rights movement and other things, in terms of local government leaders who are involved in things like the fair housing work that's gone on in the region. You know, we're happy to bring whatever resources we can to bear on this conversation to make it as relevant to all of you as possible. But in these minutes remaining, are there these sort of issues? Are there people or organizations or interests that you want to hear from throughout the next 4 weeks?
I think it would be great if we could invite an elder from the Black community to tell us exactly how this was impacted, especially in the wake of the riots that occurred in the 1960s and the fact that none of the banks were willing to reinvest in the community after that. I think that would be very telling for us to hear in their own voices. I mean, I'm in the mode where I need to be listening to people, and I'd love to hear from them if we could.
Yep, that's a great suggestion. Any other thoughts?
I suggest Marty Schuchert, since redlining didn't just impact people of color, but you know, as a former city planner, and how, you know, his historical perspective, but also how it impacted Jewish people here in Omaha too.
Yeah, absolutely. Marty's a close colleague.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm wondering if Marty might be willing to tell us if there are others who had experiences that, looking back on, they feel shame about, and you know, if someone's willing to be vulnerable with us, I think that would be really powerful.
And regarding the Sherwood Foundation, you know, another kind of colleague we have is Meredith Dillon, the Sherwood Foundation, that used to be with the city of Omaha and the planning department. And it's just kind of wrapping up a study around the needs of affordable housing. And the Sherwood Foundation kind of convened this study for the philanthropic community. So that would be someone that could help and to address that issue that Jeff brought up about their role in kind of purchasing some land, especially in North Omaha. So we can do that. And to the point of churches and religion, that how do we sort of, because I'm thinking about like kind of interrogating the role of faith communities in upholding some of the issues of supremacy, and then how might those communities be a part of, what practices do they need to think through in being a part of the solution or undoing those structures.
Mike, you said something about lenders and real estate folk. I'd really like to hear from some current people and what their experience is and what they think they have to offer as some remedial approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a number of people I think that we could pull in for those kinds of conversations who were involved in the AFFH work, you know, involved in HUD projects, Omaha Housing Authority type of work. So yeah, we'll add that to the list.
Another idea is there a city that's fixed it or has made meaningful, you know, anyone made meaningful
Good question.
Impact, and could we hear from them?
But you could skip ahead to the last chapter of the book and find out. I think that there's some that you could say have made meaningful progress, but I don't know that anybody's fixed it. And I think, you know, the policies that are generally palatable don't really sort of match the scale of the problem. You know, it might provide some opportunity through programs like Section 8 vouchers to, you know, connect people to new neighborhoods and new opportunities outside of, you know, concentrations of poverty and concentrations of you know, racial and ethnic groups, but, you know, certainly not transformative at the scale of a region that I've, you know, seen. But That's a good question. And I think there are a lot of success stories that the author points to.
And
I always look at it through, what hats we're wearing. So if it's possible for the three of us to look together at what the city is, and I can find the faith leaders in that city who had an impact, and you can find the city planners, and we can invite them to come have a conversation about where the intersection of their work was, so that we can think about the intersection of our work. I think that might be particularly powerful.
Yeah, that'd be
really good. The city of Minneapolis is one that, recently decided to, basically prohibit exclusively single family zoning, which you think about a single family house, and to the point earlier about lending opportunities, and that is exclusionary, and it perpetuates the segregation. So we have some connections there we could maybe think about. And to Sierra's point about the role of infrastructure and freeways, eventually Mike and his team at Mappas put together a series of maps that we can kind of look through what the neighborhood looked like prior to Highway 75 and then after, and kind of talk through what the engagement with the community, and how even, we've talked about this before, like the Omaha World Herald and the Omaha Star, how those two newspapers talked about that project from a position of power to a position that's without power. So we will definitely plan to have that be part of our conversation as well. Yep, Cesar, that's good. Definitely be in touch with Cesar, South Omaha. So
did you say this is going to be 12 weeks?
Yeah. You'll get three credits you can apply to your urban studies program at UNO when you're finished.
I think too, if it's possible to get somebody involved with the how education has been addressed and access in the Omaha public school system and in the surrounding areas historically, and what's happening now would be helpful.
I think something that really piggyback off of that too is just the relationship between how we fund our public schools, because mostly in Nebraska, we're mostly funded by property taxes. And if you look at OPS boundaries, not only do you have some of the lowest property tax assessments, but you also have several corporations that are home to or take up a lot of land space that are not paying any taxes, so that we can keep those corporations in our state. So great.
Excellent.
That is a good point. That's one thing we wanted to think about too, is like we as a group of 39, 40 people, whatever we might be, what can we do as individuals to affect policy change? Probably, not much, unfortunately, but who are we connected to that does have that relationship, or what's the collective power that we all have to, and thinking through that around policy and local actions, what is it we can do in this 5 weeks to think through the next steps, action steps? And so touching on policy, how schools are funded, property tax, incentives, all these things that we can begin to shine a light on, and then hopefully you all as connected people to other initiatives or organizations can be a part of that, of connecting towards action.
Well, we'll be respectful of your time, and we'll end tonight's discussion there. Thank you all for your participation. It's always worrisome when we start a book discussion like this. We always hope people are willing to discuss the actual topic, but we appreciate everybody's input tonight, and we're looking forward to the next 4 weeks. So as Jeff noted, I think we'll work with Sierra to send out kind of the reading guide for the next several weeks here. I think we're aiming for chapter 4, getting through chapter 4 by next week.
Right, finishing 1 through 4. And then in addition to what Sierra will send out, we'll also provide some other links to other best places where this has worked or not worked, other maps from our region, to provide more local context. So you'll get a series of those links to look through and prepare for next time. And speaking of next time, I'll be out of town on a cabin in North Minnesota next to Canada. You can't get to Canada right now, but I'm going to attempt to get to Canada. But I'll be out next week, so Mike will be leading next week as well.
Thank you both
Speaking
for
of,
leading this.
Yeah, speaking of that, we're recording each session. So if you are going to be away or miss it, Sierra will send a follow-up email each week so that you can have a chance to see or listen in if you've missed it or want to listen again.
Yes. Yeah, I will look for an email from me tomorrow, and I'll send you a recording and just a recap. And then I'll try to by Monday every week get an email out. So thank you all so much for being here tonight.
Thank you very much, Sierra and Wendy. Thank you for
Thanks,
hosting
everyone.
us, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sierra. We'll see you.